Welcome back. This is the final video in my series on writing a DBQ essay, and in this video we're actually going to get into the nuts and bolts of how to write the essay. Now that you've finished your planning, you've put together your groups of documents, you've established some context, we're going to talk about how that essay actually comes together. So first let's talk about the rubric. Number one, there is up to 1 point available if you successfully complete the task of establishing historical context for the prompt. So as long as you do this once, you get that point. If you don't do it, you get 0. For the thesis statement, you get up to 1 point if you successfully establish a thesis statement with a very clear line of reasoning, and if it appears in either your introduction or your conclusion. I've got another video just about writing thesis statements. You can go look at that for more help there. Now, the core of a DBQ, though, is supporting your arguments using evidence. And there's up to 3 points available for doing this successfully. If you use evidence from at least 3 documents out of the 7 to support your arguments, you get 1 point in the rubric. So this is kind of like partial credit. And what this means is that if you are blanking a little bit, if you're having some trouble interpreting the documents, use as many of the documents as you can. Even if it's not all of them, you can still get a point for at least 3. And you can still establish a good thesis statement, and you can still establish arguments based on that smaller number of documents, and you can still get a good score. But if you use evidence from at least 6 documents, that is 2 points instead of 1 point. So that means that there is partial credit available, but you should try to shoot for at least 6 documents. If you understand all 7 very clearly, use all 7 just to make sure you're covering your bases and to make sure that you are basically showing as much complexity as you can in your argumentation. But at least 6 documents, that's 2 points instead of 1. Then, as long as you use at least 1 example of outside knowledge, specific, detailed outside knowledge as evidence, that's 1 more point. So that's up to 3 total for using evidence. So once again, 1 example of outside knowledge used effectively as evidence is 1 point. Then you need to do analysis of sourcing for at least 3 documents in order to get 1 more point. So you should try to do this, attempt this for as many documents as you can, once again, just to cover your bases. But as long as you do it successfully at least 3 times, then you'll get the point for it. And we'll see plenty of examples coming up of how to do this successfully and how to really think about it. So these are 6 points. There is 1 more point available for showing complex understanding. And I've decided not to include that because I want to focus more on just the basics of writing a good solid essay that clearly argues using solid evidence. The complexity point is, you can kind of look at it as extra credit for going above and beyond just the basic requirements of the prompt. I'm focusing on the basics here to make sure that you max out your score within that framework of 6 points that I think are easier to achieve. So now let's move on to the essay itself. And the sample essay that I'm writing here in front of you will cover all of the bases of how to really get the basic points, the 6 that are the easiest to achieve within the prompt. So first we've got an introduction. Ideally, you should begin with a couple of sentences where you establish historical context for the prompt. Now once again, if you weren't able to come up with good context before you begin writing the essay, then if you are planning and if you're writing and you think of some context to include, you can put it anywhere in the essay. You can put it in the conclusion, as long as it's in there somewhere. Ideally, though, it should be at the beginning, and it should be kind of a lead-in to your thesis statement. So then your thesis statement is the last few sentences of the introduction, where you establish what the arguments are that you're going to make in response to the prompt. Now you can see I've color-coded. Context is green, and it kind of tells the story of, Buddhism being founded, how it became popular in the first place, how it made its way along the Silk Road into China, which types of Buddhism became popular in China, basically telling the story, setting the background and foundation for our discussion of Buddhism in Chinese society during this time period. Then the thesis Once again, your thesis should be specific and establish a very clear line of reasoning based on the evidence. It will never be enough for a prompt like this to just say, oh, well, some people accepted it, some people didn't. You need to be very clear about exactly the arguments you're going to be making over the course of the essay. And once again, if you saw some change over time occurring, include that within the sort of structure of your arguments. So now let's move along to the first body paragraph. So we're now going to get into our first body paragraph. And the way that I like to think about the body paragraphs is by taking one of the arguments you made in your thesis and now expanding upon it, elaborating it in each body paragraph. And you should include the evidence from the documents and from outside knowledge that pertains to that particular argument. So every body paragraph should start with a topic sentence that very clearly shows the argument you're about to back up or support using evidence. Then you include evidence, whether it's outside knowledge or documents. And for the documents, you should make attempts at sourcing analysis in your discussion of the documents themselves. So the color coding here, topic sentences aren't highlighted, but anytime I'm using evidence to support an argument, that's going to be blue. So the topic sentence, the argument we're dealing with first is that Buddhism was able to find wide acceptance and many converts in China. Pretty straightforward. So now I begin though with some outside knowledge as evidence. And you can see, if you stop and read this, that it's essentially talking about how Buddhism became popular in the first place. What types of people were drawn to Buddhism? Why were they drawn to Buddhism? So this is a good example of how to bring in something that's not specifically mentioned in the documents that helps you explain why this argument is true and kind of elaborates on or adds more depth to the evidence that's actually in the documents. So that's outside knowledge as evidence. So now, let's start talking about the documents. First of all, you should always use linking statements like this in order to make sure that your evidence is getting connected back to the arguments you're supporting. So, if you're talking about acceptance and conversion in China, you should say, an example of this acceptance was, and then you explain the evidence in the document that shows you that. When you are citing the documents, use the author's name when possible, or say what the document is when possible. You should also include a reference to the document number, whether it's in parentheses or just like in your sentence, but always use the author's name because the documents themselves are inanimate objects. The people who wrote the documents are the ones who are really speaking to us over the years. So, be careful to not quote too much. You can use like a word here and there that's really powerful from the writing, but you should really just basically explain what did this person say and how is that an example of that argument. So here, an example of acceptance was Mauza, document 1, who defended Buddhism in his book Disposing of Error. He presents critical questions that a Confucian might ask a Buddhist, but then instructs Buddhists in how to respond to these criticisms. And in these responses, he favorably compares the Buddha to other philosophers by calling the Buddha a unicorn and a phoenix. So basically it's showing, look, this guy defends Buddhism, this guy likes Buddhism. There's the evidence. Now this attempt at sourcing though, this attempt at explaining like why this guy felt this way or said this particular thing is unsuccessful. This is an attempt at sourcing through the author's background, but it's never going to be enough to just say what the author's background was. Instead, you need to do something like this, where you really explain how his personal background meant something, how it affects the way that we might interpret the document, how it affected and motivated what he said in the document. So, because of Mauza's personal background of conversion from Confucianism to Buddhism, he may be presenting questions and answers that he personally had to grapple with while adopting his new religion. So this is very clearly explaining, because of this guy's personal background, that is why he said this. That is why he showed us this. That is what sourcing statements are. That is what sourcing analysis is. So every time we see it in our sample essay, it's going to be color-coded yellow. And you should always include it right there after you explain the document itself. Now, the next document in this group is the next one that we'll go to in our body paragraph. So remember, the documents don't just explain them in numerical order over the course of the essay. Break them down into the groups of documents that are relevant to each argument, and then include in the body paragraph every document that is relevant to that argument. So you can pause it and you can read through this, and once again, another example of using evidence to support an argument. Now, for a moment, I'd like to home in on what we really mean, once again, when we talk about sourcing, and to compare this unsuccessful type of sourcing to this successful sourcing analysis. And you can see the big difference here is that you're not just explaining what the author's personal background was, but really thinking about how that is important. How is that relevant? How does that motivate what he is or is not saying to us in this document? So once again, taking that extra leap of why that is important, how that is important, is the key for understanding sourcing. So now we're going to transition into our second body paragraph. So in the first body paragraph, we talked about the first part of our argument, how we saw that there were many people who accepted Buddhism in China and were willing to defend it from attack and so on. But now we're going to show the other argument that is part of our evaluation, that despite this popularity, there were still some efforts by elites to suppress it due to its non-Chinese origins. So if you back up to the introduction and look at our thesis, we basically have split the thesis statement. One part of it went in body paragraph 1, and now the second part of it, the second group of documents, goes into body paragraph 2. And you can see we begin again with another topic sentence, and then here we're getting right into the evidence from the documents, in this case document 2. And you can see an explanation of the document and how it serves as evidence for the idea that some elites were trying to suppress Buddhism because of its non-Chinese origins. And once again, it's really important. Don't just quote the document, explain how the things it says are showing us that your argument is true and defensible. Now, this attempt at sourcing in yellow, is this successful? No. The answer is no. If you simply say, however, he was biased because he was a Confucian scholar, that is never going to be enough, because there's no explanation of how he was biased or the way his bias was, going to show itself in the document. Instead, you need to say something like this. However, he may have been misrepresenting Buddhism because, due to his background as a Confucian scholar, he had little first-hand understanding of Buddhist beliefs or practices and was interested in protecting the status of Confucianism in China. That's a much better example of sourcing, because once again, it's taking that leap from just, who was this guy, to why was that important? Why was that a thing we need to discuss in order to better understand the document? And there's other ways to do it. You could think about audience or purpose for the document and how that might influence it. However, he may have been exaggerating his criticisms in order to fulfill his purpose of convincing the emperor that Buddhism had been a negative influence in China and that it should be suppressed. So now this is explaining how his purpose is really relevant to analyzing this document and how that explains why we're seeing what we're seeing in the document. Another example. However, he may have been exaggerating his criticism because he was trying to convince his audience, the emperor himself, that Buddhism had been a negative influence in China and that it should be suppressed. So that is good sourcing. So now let's move along. So now we go to the other document that also supports the same argument, document 4. And here we can see evidence from the document to explain that argument, to support that argument. And yeah, there's a little short quote, but there's more explanation of how that quote connects to the argument, how it shows that this guy is, trying to suppress Buddhism, that the emperor is turning against Buddhism because of its non-Chinese origins. Now, this example of sourcing is based on historical context. And the context here is that the emperor, he was influenced by Chinese Confucian philosophy, which was deeply influential within Chinese society. So it's not talking about his background, it's not talking about his audience or his purpose. Instead, it's basically explaining because there was this historical reality that Confucianism was really big and influential, chances are that is what is influencing him to feel this way. So, one important thing to keep in mind about sourcing then, as long as your analysis is plausible, based on the author's background, based on the author's context or audience or purpose, then it is a valid example of sourcing. Now, then we're going to see a little bit more outside knowledge here. So in this case, it's outside knowledge that actually kind of contradicts the evidence in the documents, but it's still outside knowledge that adds some more depth to our understanding of the whole argument. So despite this edict, Buddhism remained popular among the people of China, although later dynasties such as the Song and Ming often avoided openly supporting the religion. Instead, they tended to focus on supporting Confucian and Taoist institutions because of their origins in traditional Chinese culture. So, it's outside knowledge that's not specifically mentioned in the documents that still adds some depth to our understanding of this argument as a whole. So basically, outside knowledge can be drawn from a bunch of different directions as long as it is in service of your argument and just showing how much more you know about that particular argument. So, this slide is showing you a comparison of all of the examples of sourcing about document 2 that we just looked at in the previous body paragraph. So you can pause this and once again look at all of these different examples of sourcing analysis, how they differ from the unsuccessful one, and you can kind of get a sense here for how this should really work. So, just a couple of final thoughts about the DBQ. Number 1, write with intent. Know what you are trying to accomplish with every single word that you write on the page. So always think, am I writing my context now? Am I writing my thesis statement? Am I writing a topic sentence that establishes an argument for a body paragraph? Am I explaining evidence and how it supports my argument? Am I attempting sourcing on a document? Always think about what it is you are actually trying to accomplish to make sure that you are going after those points. Second, a good DBQ should have at least 2 body paragraphs. I mean, realistically, if you're going to be using all 7 documents in a full-length DBQ, you don't want to have just one giant body paragraph where you explain every single document and the evidence in it. Group the documents based on which arguments they support, and then split, your discussion of the evidence into those arguments. So, you should have at least 2 body paragraphs. But if one of those body paragraphs is going to become really, really big, if it's going to have, 5 documents and a discussion of the evidence from them in one body paragraph, don't be afraid to split that up too. You can have as many body paragraphs as you want. Just make sure that you use good transitions to flow from paragraph to paragraph, and always think about connecting the evidence to your topic sentences. And finally, you should write a conclusion. And in that conclusion, you should restate and possibly strengthen your thesis statement based on the things you wrote over the course of the essay. But remember, your thesis statement needs to be detailed enough and specific enough and establish lines of reasoning that show